So yeah, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Michael. I've been in the church for about a year. Hopefully I've said hello to lots of people, and I know most of you, I think. But yeah, for anyone who doesn't know me, hello. One thing you should probably know about me off the bat is that I absolutely love Daniel. If you speak to anyone who's known me for longer than about 3 weeks, they'll tell you that I just don't stop talking about Daniel. I think he is brilliant. And so when Matthew mentioned that we were going to do Daniel in the evening services, I was really, really excited. And just preparing for this, I've just been really just freshly excited by Daniel. I just think it's such a brilliant book for us to get our teeth into. So just to open, I wanted to sort of pose a question, and hopefully there's a PowerPoint that'll come up. If not, then there you go. And the question is, what is the purpose of Daniel? So as a 19-year-old lad, I went off to a Christian conference and really caught the fire for God and was really excited. And I came back and I remember having a conversation with my dad, and I said to him, "Isn't it brilliant that the Bible is so honest? That there is, it doesn't kind of hide away the flaws that people have got and the mistakes that are made. You know, we know of so many people in the Bible who make mistakes. You know, Peter who denies Jesus, and Moses who struck the rock, and we know of Noah getting drunk, and you know, some people we know by their mistakes, maybe slightly unfairly. You know, doubting Thomas. That's a cruel name for a man who spent his whole life following Jesus, isn't it? Or from Sunday school, did anyone else have Jonah the Moaner? Was that just me? Just me. Oh, there we go. 2 of us. Brilliant. Yeah. And so I had this conversation and said, isn't it brilliant that the Bible's so honest and that everyone is flawed, and I can be included in that because I am also flawed, but I'm not excluded from being part of Christ's family. And I remember having this conversation with my dad, and he said, yeah, except, he said, what about Daniel? And I said, what do you mean, what about Daniel? And I said, well, what did Daniel do wrong? I said he did something wrong. So I went and I read Daniel, and then I read it again. And I'm quite stubborn, so I probably read it a third time. I can't really remember. But the conclusion that I came to at the end is that Daniel is a fallible man like anyone else. But within the book of Daniel, we don't see him make a mistake. And so that led me to this question. Well, why not? Why did we have this book just in the middle of the Bible with this guy who apparently was not making mistakes in this book? You know, why did God want to communicate that to us? And I think in order to understand it, we need to get a bit of a grip of the context around Daniel. So I'm going to try and cover 1,000 years of Jewish history in the next 4 minutes. So wish me luck. So I've got it on the screen behind me. For the sake of simplicity, I've split it down into 4 sections. And so we'll start with the Israelites coming out of Egypt. Okay, so I've called that the Exodus. I appreciate it was wandering around the desert and then coming into the Promised Land. That's all the Exodus for me. Okay. Then we've got Judges. Then we've got Kings, and finally we've got the Exile. And so I'll just talk through each section. So you've got the Exodus. So the guys leave Egypt. Okay, and for 40 years they're wandering around the desert. Now in that time, God is with them in a powerful way. You know, they have the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire leading them, and then the Ark of the Covenant is built, and the tabernacle is built for the first time. God comes to dwell with the Israelites. It's amazing. But they don't enter the Promised Land for 40 years because they fear what is in the Promised Land. 40 years later, Joshua comes along, and finally they go into the Promised Land. So for the sake of simplicity, I've drawn a little graph at the bottom. How's it going? Now this is oversimplified, guys. This is not. So how's it going? Well, it started by improving quite a lot, and then they got stuck in the desert for a while, and then it improved a bit again. Okay, so overall, this is quite a good period for the Israelites. Yeah, are we happy with that? Good period. Okay, so then we hit the Judges. So this is a period where God appoints judges to lead the people of Israel. And really, the Judges is a period of time that is basically just the Israelites in a cycle. Okay, so it goes a bit like this. The Israelites rebel against God. God punishes them. The Israelites repent, and God saves them. And then they do the same thing again, over and over and over again. Okay, so you can see my little how's it going graph at the bottom. Up and down, up and down, up and down. But broadly, okay, you know, we stay flat through that. It's about 300 or 400 years, and they're doing okay. It's not going badly, but it's not going particularly well either. Then we hit the kings. So Israel says, we don't want judges anymore. we want kings now, okay? And quite quickly we hit a golden age for Israel. So David and Solomon, and they're building the temple, and they're winning great victories for God. And you know, David David and Solomon are really men after God's heart. And there's this amazing time with God's people and God being reconciled and living as one, and it's ace. But it lasts for about 1.5 generations, because by the end of Solomon, it's not going so well anymore, and things are on the downhill again. Okay, and quite quickly, we see Israel split into 2 nations. So it's split into Israel, which is the northern half, and Judah, which is the southern half. Okay, you with me so far? Ace, that's amazing. We've got further than I thought. So we've got Israel at the top, Judah at the bottom. Okay, and for both halves, things go downhill. Okay, so you read through Kings, and you probably have done it. You flip through, and at the start it says, he was a good king, he was a bad king, he was a good king, he was a bad king. And by the end, it goes, he was a bad king, 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 right? So up and down, but we're on a decline here. And for Israel, that decline lasted 200 years, and then they got taken over by the Assyrians, okay? For Judah, lasted a little bit longer. They made it 320 years, something like that. And that's when we come to the exile, okay? So that's the period that we're really interested in, because the exile is where Daniel is based, okay? So, in the exile, what happens? So at the start, the Babylonians come, okay? They come and invade Israel, and they take a load of the Israelites off into Babylon, okay? Now, the Israelites at this point were probably thinking, we've seen this before. You know, we've seen this up and down where things go badly, and then God comes through and we're okay and it's all right. But something happens that is very, very bad news for the Israelites at this point, okay? So Ezekiel, he sees a vision, and he sees God's glory leave the temple. Now this is the glory of God that's been with them since the tabernacle, right back in the Exodus, right? And it leaves the temple. And then the Babylonians come back and they destroy the temple. They burn down the palace and they destroy the walls of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is left in ruins, okay? So the exile, pretty bad. You can see, look, I've gone off the bottom there, just to illustrate how bad it gets. Okay, so that's the context that we've got. Things are going badly for the Israelites. And into that, you've got Daniel, who gets taken off into Babylon. Okay, so the next question is, well, okay, that's what's happening with Israel. What's Babylon? What's going on with Babylon, okay? So, next slide, please. Fabulous. So, Babylon really appears in the Bible 3 times, okay? We see it at the start, right at the beginning of the Bible. We see it right at the end of the Bible. And we see it in the exile in the middle, okay? And so what we'll do is we'll have a look at the start and we'll have a look at the end in order to give us an idea of what Babylon is like. Does that seem sensible? Okay, so right at the beginning, Genesis 11, you've got the Tower of Babel. Now, you may not have made this link, but Babel and Babylon are the same place, okay? So the Tower of Babel is Babylon, okay? And so what happens in the story of the Tower of Babel is the people in the world, just shortly after Noah, the people decide, right, we're going to build this great city for ourselves. You know, I've got the quote there that says, you know, let us build a city for ourselves. Let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to heaven, so that we may make for ourselves a name. This isn't about God. This isn't about the glory of God. This is about saying, we're okay now, God. We've got this big city. We don't need to worry about you anymore. So they set themselves up. The start of Babylon is opposition to God. Okay? Now you think that's bad. The end of the Bible is even more brutal. Okay, so we go to Revelation. So Revelation 17 this is. And what you find is Babylon is again talked about. This time it's talked about in the context. It's described as a woman. And again, I've got a quote there. So this describes Babylon. It says, she's filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries, drunk with the blood of God's holy people. She's described as the mother of all prostitutes, right? This is not a good place. Are we getting that message? Yeah. Babylon, not good, opposition to God, okay? Ace. And so into this context, we've got Daniel. So Daniel is facing his people of God are in decline. The state of Israel is a failed state at this point. You know, Judah has collapsed. It's been divided. God apparently has left his people. The temple is being burned down. This is bad for Daniel. And he's been taken into the place of God's enemies. Okay? And so the question is, in that context, going back to the original question, what is the purpose of Daniel? And I've got two answers for this. The first is that I think Daniel is a book all about surviving in Babylon. Because Daniel had every reason to give up. You know, all the stuff that I've just listed, right? It was a bad state of affairs for Daniel. And he was being taken into the place of God's enemies and being ruled over by the most powerful king in the world. Okay? And so Daniel, in the face of that, it's a book about how he stands firm on God's promises and he stands firm for God. And, you know, I've put that quote from Ephesians where it talks about you stand against the devil's schemes. You have to put on the full armour of God and stand against the schemes of the devil. And that can be how it feels sometimes being a Christian. You know, sometimes it just feels like all we can do is stand. All we can do is keep our head above the water. You know, just make it day to day. And for a lot of us, that is a reality. And so having Daniel as an example of how we can do that is brilliant. For others of us, we might be having a really good time with God at the minute, actually, and really engaging with our quiet time and, you know, things are going good at work, etc. And for those people, I'd point you to Jeremiah 29, right? We know this verse. We know the plans that God's got for us, right? Plans to give us a hope and a future, right? We know that verse, yeah? And quite often, we read verses like that and we think, that's a nice verse that's written for me. It's written for Michael. Michael, I know the plans that I've got for you. Sounds good. What's interesting is that it's written to a specific set of people, and that specific set of people is the exiles in Babylon. Okay? So God's telling the people in Babylon, I don't just want you to survive, I want you to thrive. I want more than just keeping your head above the water. And so my kind of summary is I would describe Daniel as a book teaching us to survive and thrive in Babylon in the face of opposition and oppression. And I just think, what a brilliant book and what a brilliant blueprint for us to have, something that gives us that advice and that wisdom. And so that's what we're going to jump into. And so I think it makes sense to read some of Daniel. And so I'm going to ask G to come up and read it for me because there's too many long names and complicated words. So G's going to do all that for me.
Can you hear me? I don't know if that's... Can I just...
Yeah.
Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. There he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Thanks, Jude. Okay. So it doesn't take us long, does it, to see Babylon trying to challenge God? So I reckon we get to verse 2 before Babylon starts showing their true colours, right? So they take the cups and the bowls and the whatever from the temple of God, and they put them in the temple of their God. And that is a statement, really, a challenge. I've put underneath sanctity. What it's saying is, your God isn't special, your God isn't holy, and actually we'll take the things that were set apart and sacred to your God, and we'll put them in our temple. They're ours now. Okay? And so we see the Babylonians opposing God in that. We also see the Babylonians opposing God in the food of the king's table. Now, this is a bit of a strange one, because at first glance, you might think that's kind of the king. He's offering them food. That's very good of him. But the truth is, God has set laws for the Israelites, and they need to follow them in terms of what they can and can't eat. And the food of the king's table included food that the Israelites could not eat. Okay? And so the king's saying, eat this food, but God said, don't eat this food. So for Daniel and the other Israelites, they've got this challenge here of, do we follow the authority of the king, who's saying eat the food, or do we follow the authority of God, who's saying don't eat the food? Okay? And the third one, and I think this is really interesting in light of the sermon this morning, is that they replaced their names. Okay, so I don't know if anyone can remember, but this morning Matthew gave 3 reasons to be holy. And the second of those 3 reasons was God is judge. Yeah? Do you remember that? Some nodding. Hey, great. Now, what's really interesting is that the name Daniel means God is my judge. That is what that name means. And not just any God. The L at the end is a reference to the Jewish God, to Elohim, to El Shaddai. It's saying our God is our judge, okay? And so the Babylonians see that, and they see that it's a reason to be holy, and they look at that and say, we don't want Daniel to follow that. And so they say, we're not going to call you Daniel anymore. We're going to call you Belteshazzar. Okay, so what does Belteshazzar mean? Well, it means Baal protect the king. Okay, so what they're doing is they're saying, no longer are you going to be named after your God. Now you're going to be named after my God. And we know that it's not an accident because it happens 4 times. All 4 of the Israelites are named after God. So you can see El and 2 of them. So Mishael and Daniel. And the other 2, Hananiah and Azariah. So the Y at the end is Yahweh. Okay, so all 4 are named after God. And they look at all 4 and say, we're not going to let you keep that as part of your identity. We're going to change it, and you're now going to be pointed at our God and not at your God. So 3 ways that the Babylonians try to oppose God. Okay? So the question is, what is Daniel's response? And again, I think I've got 3 points. And the first one, I said Daniel chooses not to conform. To be honest, after this morning, I could have written Daniel chooses holiness, right? This is what the sermon this morning was about. So this is Daniel putting into practice what Matthew preached on this morning. So there is a choice for us to make. He could have just knuckled under and done what everyone else is doing and eaten the food of the king's table, fine. And it would have been easier for him to do that. But Daniel knows that that is wrong. He knows that that's not what God has called him to. And so he takes a stand and he says, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow the authority of my God and not the authority that the king is trying to impose on me. Okay? And I really wanted to highlight something here, that Daniel chooses not to conform to the standard of the Babylonians, but he also chooses not to conform to the standard of the Israelites. And this is a really interesting point to me, is that there were loads of Israelites who were taken as exiles into Babylon. And I wonder how many of them sat at the king's table and looked at the guy on their left or the guy on their right as they ate of the king's food and said, well, if he's doing it, it's okay for me to do it. If these Israelites are all saying it's fine, eat the food, then I'll eat the food as well. And I think it's really important to recognise that, because I think sometimes we as a church, not just Sunbridge, but we as a global church, can be really good at saying we're not like the world, we don't want to be like the world. But we can be really bad at saying we don't want to just be like the church. You know, we look at past Christians, you know, Wesley or Wigglesworth or whoever, or church, you know, Matthew, to look at church leaders and you say, I'd like to be like that. And there's nothing wrong with having role models, but we're not called to that standard. The standard that we're called to is Christ. Yeah? And so I think it's really, really important to notice that Daniel is not just conforming to what those around him are doing in the people of God or out of the people of God. He is following what God has told him to do. And I think that is what we are challenged to do. The second thing that Daniel does is Daniel seeks out support. Okay, so I don't know if anyone noticed this, but when Daniel is first faced with this problem, he says, I don't want to do this. And he goes to the chief of the stewards and he says, I don't want to do this. But within 3 verses, Daniel has turned into Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. That one, I can't say his name. It's too close to my name and I can't cope with it. So 1 has turned into 4. So Daniel realises that actually he can take other people with him, that he doesn't have to do this on his own. And I think that is a really, really important point for us. You know, I mentioned before, we don't want to conform to the way the people around us are, but actually we want to encourage the people around us to conform to God's will. And that's a really, I love that picture of Daniel saying to those around him, saying, look, actually guys, this is what God's told us to be, and this is what God's told us to do. And so let's do it, and let's do it together. And spoilers, throughout the next few chapters of Daniel, you will see how important it is to Daniel that he has a support network around him. These other 3 guys are with him for the first 3 or 4 chapters of Daniel, and he needs them. The fact that he took them on this initial journey is so important for his longevity in staying faithful to God. And I think that is a really key point, is that if you know, there's that famous saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think it's really applicable to the Christian faith. And the third thing, the final thing, is that Daniel rejects the lies that are spoken over him. So, question to the room, the Bible scholars, feel free to shout out, okay? It's a tricky question. What is the name of the disciple who denies Jesus? Peter, okay? What is the name of the apostle to the Gentiles? So isn't it interesting that Peter's name is Peter and not Simon, and Paul's name is Paul and not Saul? But we're not reading the book of Belteshazzar right now, because when you look at Peter, Peter accepted his new identity. He said, yeah, Jesus tells me that's who I am, that's who I am. And when Paul was told, you're going to be Paul now, he said, yeah, that's me, I'm Paul now. One of the things that I just think is amazing about Daniel is that Daniel says, no, I'm not Belteshazzar, I'm Daniel, God is my judge. And he stands on that, and it's one of the most fascinating things to watch as you read through Daniel, is that there is this battle, both a metaphorical battle, but also a literal battle for Daniel's identity. And you read in chapter 3, 4, whatever, where it says, Belteshazzar, who is also called Daniel. Daniel, brackets, who the king calls Belteshazzar. And it's like this tug of war that's going on between Daniel and all of those around him. And all of those around him are saying, you're Belteshazzar. And Daniel's saying, no, God is my judge. I'm Daniel. And I just love this image of this young lad who literally spends 70 years of his life telling people, I'm Daniel, I'm Daniel. And everyone around him saying, no, you're not. You're not, you're Belteshazzar. And Daniel stands firm on his promise. And there's a beautiful bit in Daniel 6 that I'll read out that I just think is just God's grace personified, really. It's Daniel 6, 25 to 27. And basically it's the king at the time, and he is making a declaration. And it says this. So it says, then King Darius wrote to all the nations and people of every nation in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in all the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. See, on face value, that's a great declaration about God, right? That's about all we see in it. I was at a wedding last week, and I was chatting to a guy there who's called Vaughan Pollard. Except that on that day, he wasn't called Vaughan Pollard. He was known as the father of the bride, okay? And he was known as the father of the bride because he wanted to be associated with the bride. He wanted to say, she's mine, she's mine. And one of the things that I think is amazing about this is that God could have put any of his names in here, right? God has so many names, Yahweh, Jehovah, Elohim, whatever. God has many names. And the name that God chooses to put on the king's lips in this declaration is the God of Daniel. And I just think that is an amazing moment for Daniel, who has spent his whole life saying, I'm Daniel, God is my judge. And then at the end of it, God says, he's mine. I'm the God that he's been talking about all these years. He's mine. And I think there is something incredible and powerful in the fact that the Babylonians tried to call him Belteshazzar, Baal protect the king, okay? Well, the king died. The kingdom fell, but the truth remained. And in the end, Daniel is proclaimed to all of the earth as being Daniel. And I just think, what an amazing promise that is, that the truth remains. And I think in closing, I'd just ask, what are the truths that you are standing on? And what are the lies that you have bought into? What are the things that you let the world tell you that just aren't true, and that actually they will wash away one day, but we don't want to build our lives on them today. We don't want to be living in a way that isn't true. So what we'll do is we'll have a couple of questions, and what we'll do is we'll gather around in our tables and we're going to discuss these. I think probably the top two questions are good questions for discussion as a whole table, and then maybe the bottom two are for reflection individually and with yourself. So the questions are, in what ways are the challenges of Daniel and his peers similar to our own, and how do they differ? And then how can we effectively build each other up as believers and challenge our wrong cultures? And then for the two, just sort of more for reflection, are who's supporting you in your walk with the Lord, and what lies do you need to address in your own life? So we'll spend a bit of time talking through those questions, and then I think Luke will come back up afterwards. So